My grandfather made a choice in 1945 that bound our family to a secret for half a century. He could have turned away. He could have called men in uniforms, marked a corpse on a map, let the mountain keep its mystery. Instead, he put a blanket over the thing's shoulders, fed it what little he had, and walked it across the ridge into our lives. For the rest of my childhood, I learned to answer a bell on the back porch the way other kids learned to answer their names. For the rest of my life, I would hear that bell and think of the weight of promises that outlive men. People like short, clean stories. The myth, the monster, the reveal. Ours never fit any tidy column. It was a domestic thing, stubbornly ordinary and therefore harder to explain. Ezra was 7'3" and walked on large, soft feet, but he ate off a dented enamel plate and slept under a wool blanket patched by my grandmother. He had a way of sitting close to the hearth and watching you like a man who had learned to count heartbeats. He didn't speak the way we do. He made low, resonant sounds sometimes, and he learned gestures that could be read if you were willing to watch for a long time. We learned to watch. The Bitterroots are the kind of place that holds its own. Granite angles, long winters that strip the color from the world and reveal the bone. Our cabin sat on a slope where the forest thinned into meadows. In summer, the air smelt like resin and warm earth. In winter, it smelled of wood smoke and iron. The house itself was all angles and repairs, a family museum of necessary work. Dusty boots by the back door, a bell that hung from a nail and had long since lost its original ring, a photo album whose pages curled with the years. In one of those photos, Thomas, my grandfather, squinted into the sun and had the same set of hands I did now. Wide, weathered, the thumb knuckled from an old splinter. He had kept secrets so well they became habits. You closed the door, you cleaned up the tracks, and you taught the children to look out for the bell. That bell was our code. A knock at the wrong time could mean a neighbor or a mail carrier. A single, steady ring meant the family. No questions, no strangers. 3 slow rings meant danger. My mother, Evelyn, who kept the accounting for our little property and the ledger of favors exchanged in town, taught all of us to listen. She kept the rules as if they were prayer. Never turn Ezra into a curiosity. Never leave food where a visitor might see it. Never take a photograph without asking first. On warm afternoons, she'd sit in the kitchen and stitch, and Ezra would sit not far away and make little marks in the dirt with a stick. He watched that needle in my mother's hands as if he could understand the logic of mending. I was not born when Thomas first found him. I was born later into a house where the bell and the blanket and the silence already had a rhythm. When my grandmother told the story, she did it like a hymn, soft and steady. Thomas was a man who had seen war and returned with hands that refused to stop working. The mountain had given him something wounded, and he had put it in the back cabin because he could not walk away from a grieving creature. In the story, Thomas didn't make a speech. He wrapped a blanket around a shivering shoulder and gave the creature his name, Ezra. Names matter. The name made the thing in the back cabin more than a thing to be hidden. It fixed him to us. We taught Ezra how to be part of a household, because that's what families teach. He learned the rhythm of afternoons. Wood cutting in the morning with my father. Catherine, my wife, would later joke about my solemnity when it came to splitting logs, and then bread warmed on the hearth. He learned that light falling at a certain angle meant supper would be ready. He was fastidious about certain small things. He wiped his hands before he ate. He replaced boards that had been moved, and he never took more than his share. Children are devils for routine, and it was the children who taught Ezra first. My oldest, Michael, taught him to watch the cattle and to recognize a wayward steer. Sarah, who at 15 was already capable of making you laugh until your stomach hurt, spent afternoons reading aloud to him. Emma, 12 and still fierce with empathy, made drawings of him that she hung on the refrigerator by the flour tin. They were not cruel drawings. Round faces, a hand in ours, the mountain behind. Ezra would point to the pictures and make sounds that shifted with the mood of the room. It is important to say, plainly, that Ezra was not a pet. He was not an exhibit. He was something in between. a being with habits and preferences, who by the slow arithmetic of affection became a member of our household. We established rules for him as we would for anyone. No wandering beyond the old stone fence at night. Leave the porch light on until 11. If the bell rings twice from the ridge, go to the cellar until someone says otherwise. These rules protected him by protecting the family, and they protected the family by defining the boundaries the rest of the world could not cross. You would be surprised how much of secrecy is logistical, where the compost bin is hidden, which trail is safe in snow. You would be surprised how much of secrecy is love. The way my mother would sleep at the foot of his bed when he had nightmares. The way my sister Sarah would hum lullabies that had no words. We were also, reluctantly, technicians of concealment. For 50 years, we learned the fine arts of erasure. Clean the footprints in soft mud with a brush. Hide hair in a shed, and, under the old wood shavings, a lock of our own hair, so the blood that had been shed was not the only story on the land. When winter came and the snow made everything visible, tracks like an accusation laid in white, we would trample patterns that made the prints look like deer or bear. We learned to put out empty milk bottles so the mailman would think the house had been occupied. We learned to answer questions with silence. People are used to silence. It sounds like privacy. Secrecy sounded like a place to live, and we dug ourselves in deep. There were close calls. A kid from town once came out too far and almost saw Ezra through the pines. My mother paid him for silence with a morning's work at the bakery and a basket of pies. Once, a surveyor's team came through the ridge looking for old logging roads. They set up a tape measure and a camp not 20 miles away, and the whole summer felt like a watch. Those brushes with the world were sharpeners. They honed our fear and honed our protocols. But for the most part, the decades drifted the way seasons do. Fall falling into winter, then sleep, then a tentative thaw. Thomas died eventually, leaning on his cane and insisting on one last round of wood splitting despite his breath. He left behind a knot of instructions and a cave dug into the slope, a fallback shelter he had carved during years when he worried the world would come looking for what he had carried home. The cave was a methodical collection of things: jars, dried food, a makeshift client of comforts, and a map of the forest he'd drawn by memory. He called it the old man's insurance policy, and joked that someday the land would be a ledger that owed him. When he died, we mourned the man, and we inherited the choice. Those of us who slept in the small rooms at the back of the cabin learned, quietly, how to keep a promise. You keep things not because law tells you to, but because someone asked you to while their hands were cold. The kids grew. Michael learned to drive the truck over a ditch and into winters without radio. Sarah, she was the heart, always. Learned more than that. She learned to listen. She could sit with Ezra and watch him do 100 meaningless gestures and suddenly say, "He's trying to explain the way he remembers rain." There were things about his memory that were naughty. He could map the slope of the land with his fingers. He could find a lost boot as if measurement lived in his palms. He could name, by touch, where a rock had come from. When he wanted to show consent, he would point at 2 images arranged on the kitchen table, a loaf of bread and a picture of snow. He would point, and a unanimous nod from at least 2 witnesses became what we accepted as assent. I should be painfully clear. Our acceptance of Ezra's gestures as agency was the work of people who had made promises. We set up tests. We would show him a picture of the cabin and a picture of the meadow. We would leave the cabin door open and the meadow closed, and watch if he chose to step into daylight on his own. Sometimes he would choose the meadow. Sometimes he stayed under the eaves. Repetition mattered. An action that occurred once might be coincidence. An action that happened in the same way under different conditions suggested a pattern. Dr. Patricia Chen, a bioethicist we later met, would call these consistent, repeatable choices. In the early years of our secrecy, before anyone else knew how to name such things, we called them decisions. Behind every decision, there was fear. Years ago, someone shot a young elk 15 miles away. Hunters put up signs about trespassing, and strangers started to ask if we'd seen anything unusual on the trails. Hawkers of rumor came by now and then. An eccentric clergyman from the next county who wanted to hold prayer for mountain spirits. A businessman who claimed he could rehabilitate the beast for a traveling show. Each one a test we passed by refusing to answer. Sometimes the refusal was small. Sometimes it required blunt force. Threats in phone calls, a car turning through our drive uninvited. Each time we pushed back with the steady, domestic defiance of people who love something unorthodox. If secrecy had rules, exposure had a grammar we tried to avoid. But by the early 1990s, the grammar of surveillance was changing. You could feel it in town. New men with clipboards who spoke in a careful, flat cadence about accurate records. People who measured silence as if it were data. The Montana Wilderness Survey Project was a thing, with a budget and a conscience. A team from the state and federal lines of oversight that had names and agendas we had not anticipated. They brought gear that hummed, not menacingly, just clinically. Motion sensor cameras that could be left with batteries for a week. Thermal imaging that drew heat like a map of animal life. And a quiet kind of curiosity that moved through the forest like an insect. The first time I knew they were close was a footprint in snow that did not lie. On a cold March morning in 1995, I took the truck out to check a fence line and found a set of prints larger than anything I had seen that winter. Long toes, splayed, heavy, and heading toward the river. Someone else had been there before us. The tracks had crossed a path we used for cattle and then gone on into denser pines. That same week, a man named Patterson, a Forest Service ranger I had met at town meetings, stopped by to ask more questions than a man does when he is simply doing a favor. He had a map with red pins and a brow that caught sunlight like a knife. His tone was not aggressive, but it was precise. "We're not here to make trouble, Hudson," he said, flicking a twig from the corner of his clipboard. "We've had reports, hair samples, prints. We're scanning for anomalies. If anything unusual shows up near private property, we'll notify the owner. We prefer to, well, keep things transparent." Transparency, we had learned, is a double-edged thing. It can protect, certainly. It can also render you legible in ways that permit exploitation. When I looked into Patterson's eyes, I saw not malice, but a procedural hunger. It was an appetite for classification. He wanted the world to make sense and to fit into the boxes he had been trained to use. He did not seem to understand what families owe one another. He had not been taught to keep promises the way Thomas had taught us. The town, too, changed. The diner where I would go with Catherine sometimes to take the edge off worry filled with new faces. Men in warm jackets talked about data points and baseline readings. The grocery had boxes of new trail maps marked with small notations. Even friends at the co-op spoke differently, hesitant around the edges of late-night conversations. The world was getting smaller, or at least more mapped. For a family that had lived by the patience of snow, the new technology felt like a bell whose clapper we could not control. Once, in an early attempt at damage control, I wrote a note to Dr. Foster, Rachel Foster, the woman who had signed my name on a form I did not fully read at the town meeting. She was the lead of the survey team, sharp, younger than I had expected, with a way of listening that made you feel heated and exposed at the same time. I told her what I thought would be a bare truth, because in my chest the old promise and the new world were starting to gnaw. I told her there was something on our land, and that whatever it was, it had been kept by my family for a long time. Her answer was clinical at first, 3 lines about protocol and field verification. But the second paragraph carried something like curiosity, and something like respect. She wrote that the team had found heat signatures on the perimeter of the survey grid, and that anomalous readings had registered near our property line. She asked if she could stop by, not with men in uniforms, but to talk before they set up equipment. It was a small mercy. The town deserved notice. I owed the thing in our back cabin a conversation. When I told Catherine, she looked at me the way she does when I call a hard decision a plan. Catherine is the practical partner in my life, hands that can measure distances and the kind of mind that can break a problem into pieces. She did not make heroics of this. She measured the risk, and then she measured the promise. If there's a way, she said, folding laundry at the table, to give us some control over who comes and when, we take it. We do it on our terms. That's all. That was how we kept most catastrophes at bay, by insisting on being the narrators of our own story. Even when you open a door, you can still choose how wide it swings. The plan was modest. Talk, show limited demonstrations of agency, and ask for a pause. We would ask that any examination be non-invasive, that no photographs be taken without consent, consent being a much larger idea than a single nod, and that any scientific contact recognize the family's role as guardians. We asked formally for time to prepare Ezra and to consider his wishes. I'm not proud to say it then, but part of me also hoped that if we could approach the scientists with a request that sounded reasonable, nonviolent, respectful, we might avoid the worst. Before Dr. Foster came to our gate, though, other things happened that taught us how brittle those plans could be. A field report came back to the survey project with high-contrast thermal images, smudges of heat moving in a line through the timber. The images were grainy, the kind of picture that invites interpretation. In a meeting at the command center, an old-school gym repurposed into a makeshift operations hub, Rachel and her colleagues spread the prints and the maps across folding tables. I stood at the edge of that room feeling like a man who had been summoned to testify about his family. They showed me the pictures and asked to speak plainly. We try to be careful, Rachel said, and she was careful. But there are anomalies close to private property. We need to know if you've seen anything out of the ordinary. I could have lied. I could have shut up. Instead, I told them the truth in the only way I knew how, slowly, and with the bell of my promises clanging under the words. I said there was a being on our land that had been cared for by my family for decades. I said he had agency, and that we had a pattern of consent we were willing to demonstrate. I watched their faces alter between skepticism and interest and something like pity, though I do not know who it was for. They were good people, trained in a world where questions are answered with data. Our world was one where questions are answered with a life. Rachel did not hurry me or dismiss me. She asked about the tests we used, about whether Ezra had ever been recorded. She asked, I remember especially, what we would ask of them if they came onto the property. Her questions were professional, but threaded with humanity, a difficult, important combination. When I told her about the bell, she asked to hear it. I think there was a tenderness in that request. She wanted to understand how we signaled within the family. We arranged a visit. It would be small and official. 2 scientists, 1 ranger, and me. Not the government in force, but the government in inquiry. We'll be careful, Rachel promised. We won't rush anything on your land. Her voice carried the mechanics of assurance, and I accepted it as one accepts a rope that might save or might strangle. That night, I sat in the back kitchen and took out the photograph album. The pages smelled like night air and the glue of memory. There was a picture of Thomas and Ezra sitting by the river, a crude kind of tenderness caught in stillness. Ezra's hand rested on Thomas's knee like a question mark turned to comfort. On the page after that, there was a photograph of Michael, hair too long, waving to someone who was not visible in the frame. Sarah had insisted that Ezra be in the family photos, but we always kept his face dim, shadowed, as if he belonged to the margins of light. The album was a ledger of small mercies, a torn shirt mended, a child's laugh mid-capture, hands reaching toward each other. If you ask me then what I feared most, it would be hard to be brief. I feared the state's appetite for clarity, the way institutions can reduce a living thing to a specimen. I feared the town's curiosity, the way gossip can compress complexity into a slogan. I feared for Ezra's dignity, for the risk that being seen would not be the same as being known. Yet behind all of that, quieter and more dangerous, was an unease that had the edges of hope. What if being seen allowed him protections we had no way to grant? What if recognition meant he could move beyond the narrowness of our choices? We had kept him safe in the only way we knew how. It remained open whether our way had been enough. The night before Rachel's quiet visit, I walked the perimeter with a lantern. The air tasted of iron and snow. The pines creaked like ships. I trailed my lantern along the path my father used to take with Ezra when they checked for broken posts. The bell on the back porch hung like a promise. I thought about Thomas's cave and about all the small, private rehearsals the family had practiced. What to say, what to show, how to let Ezra choose. We would not drag him out like a curiosity. We would not allow men with clipboards to turn his life into a data point. We would ask him to indicate what he wanted, and we would ask the scientists to honor it. Morning came with light that made the snow look thin and fragile as paper. Rachel arrived with a small team, 2 quiet people who introduced themselves with clipped names and hands that shook slightly when they reached out. Ranger Patterson came as well. He stood a little off to the side, his posture that of a man who felt the weight of his responsibilities. We walked together to the back cabin because it made no sense to bring outsiders to a place they had not earned the right to enter. The reveal, if you can call a slow, consented meeting that name, was not a cinematic doorway of thunder. It was a door opening, a small intake of breath, a figure lowering his head to duck beneath the lintel. Ezra stepped into the light, and then stopped, as if the way light struck his shoulders was itself a question. For a second, everything I had ever held fragile seemed to hold too. A lifetime of repairs and vows, and the simple algebra of love. Dr. Foster and the others looked in, their training briefly superseded by the human response to the visible impossible. There was no gasp. There was instead an inhaled silence, people recalibrating. Ezra watched them with those slow, careful measures he had. He made a sound like a long chord, and then gave a small, methodical gesture toward the set of images we kept on a table. A rabbit, a loaf of bread, a picture of the sky. He pointed to 2, then to the door. Sarah, who had sat beside him on a stool, said softly, "He's asking if they mean to be kind." Rachel crouched, slow and respectful, and looked at Ezra at eye level. She said, in a voice that had the careful cadence of someone operating between wonder and protocol, "We are here to learn, to ask, to be careful. We can leave if you want us to. Will you allow us to stay a little while?" Ezra's hand hovered over the pictures. You could read the deliberation on his face, the way someone chooses a path after considering the weather. He pointed, finally, to the picture of the sky, then twice at the stretch of land beyond the cabin, and then put his palm against his chest, the small sign we had taught him to indicate assent. I remember the way Catherine's hand slid across mine. The pressure was not loud, but carried the whole weight of the family's decisions. That is where I will leave you for now. Over the table, the pictures, the palm to the chest. The government had come in the form of curiosity, and curiosity had a knock that was all but polite. We had done what families do when faced with a new kind of threat. We made a plan and asked for time. We showed the bell and the album and the pictures. We asked for respect. Whether the world would give it freely was a different question. There are places where promises bend and places where they break, and the sound a family makes when it fractures is like nothing else. If this story is holding your attention, if you want to see how a small house in the Bitterroots handled the slow, bureaucratic footfall of a modern state, stay with the story. There are negotiations to come, choices that will feel like betrayals, and others that will feel like deliverance. There will be tests, legal arguments, and at least one night I will not forget, when someone trespassed, and everything we had built, for better or worse, collided with strangers who did not understand why we had kept a secret for so long. But for now, listen to the bell of the back porch. Hear the way the mountain keeps its own counsel, and the way families keep theirs. And know that when the government knocks, it is not only the state at the door, it is the hinge of every promise you have made and must keep. We signed an informal agreement that morning, small notes, a handshake, a tentative promise to document non-invasive evidence and to allow no photographs that could be distributed without consent. It was paper at first, and we treated it like a covenant. They left with a promise to come back with a limited team, to bring equipment that would not frighten Ezra, and to involve a bioethicist if we felt it necessary. I remember Rachel's eyes at the end, earnest and tired. "We want to do this right," she said. Home that night, the kitchen smelled like coffee and cedar. The family ate slowly and all at once. We were tired in the way of people who have learned a new vocabulary for danger. Sarah washed the plates and hummed under her breath. Michael sat by the window and stared into the dark. Emma fell asleep in a chair with her sketchbook open on her lap and a pencil tucked behind her ear. I knew what Thomas would have wanted, and I knew where the cave stained the slope of the land. I knew that having the government bring its soft knock had changed the geometry of our lives. It had not yet smashed what we had, but a knock is not the same as a blessing. The next morning, I went out to check the fence again and found a piece of thermal film left on top of a fence post, as if someone had been there and left a note in their language. It was a small, bureaucratic footprint, and it smelled faintly of gasoline and tape. I carried it into the house like a relic. It sat on the stove for a while I tried to decide what it meant. It could mean nothing, just a reminder that we were being observed. Or it could mean a beginning. Either way, promises are things that must be kept. I felt the weight of them like a cold in my bones. We had asked for a voice in how Ezra's life would be examined. The people who came had given their word, but promises exist in practice as much as in speech. The work of keeping them would be harder than any of us imagined, and the kind of attention that comes from the outside has a gravity all its own. It will bend things toward light whether they are ready or not. So I sat up that night, listening to the house settle and to the dark press against the windows, and I wondered how many more doors a family could open before the world took what it wanted. I worried about the ethics of exposure, and I worried about what Ezra himself wanted. The tests we would devise had to be fair, repeatable, and, above all, human. Terms we understood, but that the law had not yet fully learned how to honor. We were about to teach officials something about consent, or else we were about to learn, painfully, the cost of refusing to teach. When the government knocks, it asks for proof. When a family promises, it asks for trust. Our house sat between those two demands, and the night kept its cold counsel. The thermal film sat on the stove like an accusation. It was a small rectangle of gray with smudged white where heat had blurred the edges, and for a moment it looked like a bird someone had crushed into the page. I poured coffee and stared at it until the kitchen blurred into steam and light. Outside, the pines held their breath the way mountains seem to hold a secret with religious intensity. Within a week, more people had names. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived with a briefcase that seemed too tidy for the forest. She wore sensible shoes and a face like a page you wanted to read. Patient, studious, the kind of intelligence that didn't need to announce itself. Victor Reeves drove up from Missoula with a suit that looked sheepish in the snow and a stack of manila folders. He introduced himself as an attorney who did strange cases, custodial rights for endangered animals, guardianship for people the law had forgotten. There was a practical edge to him. If we were cobbling protections, he wanted to know what wood and nails we had on hand. The small coalition that gathered in our kitchen felt like a jury assembled to adjudicate the household. Rachel Foster came back with a handful of field assistants. Ranger Patterson hovered at the edge like a man who had been pressed into the role of mediator. Their presence, warm in the small room, made the thresholds of our life feel as if they were under inspection. I can still see their breaths leaving soft halos in the cold air when we stepped outside to talk. "Tell me everything," Patricia said, not as an order, but as a practice. She spread a legal pad and asked questions that were specific and kind. How had we demonstrated agency? What tests had we used? How often did Ezra make choices when given options? Did he indicate pain, joy, a desire to leave? She wanted repetition, pattern, proof that consent could be observed. We walked her through the rituals as if she were being initiated. The picture tests, rabbit, loaf, sky. The way we watched his finger move and how he put his palm to his chest to say yes. The bell and its code. How we had, without law books to teach us, fashioned a kind of guardianship by practice. At the end of the first day, Dr. Chen smiled in a way that didn't belong to triumph but to cautious recognition. This is not the sort of proof that makes a court hand down a ruling tomorrow, she said, but it's evidence of deliberative behavior. It's the beginning of a conversation where we can argue that this being has interests we ought to respect. Victor heard different things in that same room. He sat at the table and listened to our tales, folding papers and refolding them, as if the act shaped legal arguments in the air. He was the kind of lawyer who liked analogy. We can build a guardianship model, he said. We can take precedent from statutes protecting marine mammals and endangered species, places where the law recognizes the need to restrict access and to manage stewardship, even if the organism doesn't have formal human rights. We can't promise immortality or absolute immunity from seizure, but we can write contracts, apply for conservation easements, create a trust for stewardship. We can make it expensive, criminally and civilly, to trespass. And we can ask for federal recognition of a habitat buffer while keeping primary custodial authority within the family. We talked about the word personhood like it was a sharp stone. Dr. Chen was careful with the term. In academic literature, it had the gravity of philosophy and the fury of politics. Personhood, she said, is not a switch the law flips easily. But the law recognizes interests, and where interests are consistent and cognizable, it provides protection. That's the route we should pursue. Show cognition, demonstrate consent, then protect the interests that flow from that evidence. That was practical counsel. The family did not want grand metaphysics. We wanted a document that a judge could look at and say, with a nod and the slow confidence of a man trained to protect property and life, this house, these people, have been entrusted with care. We wanted a barrier between Ezra and the appetites of the marketplace. Negotiations began, and they were, by degrees, theatrical. James Morrison, a Department of the Interior representative in a dark overcoat, drove in one wet afternoon with the posture of someone who had been assigned to a problem that would go on the evening news no matter how carefully he moved. He said, in tones meant to be even, that federal interests had to be considered. We have obligations, he told the group. Scientific inquiry is one thing, public safety is another. Once something becomes public, it becomes the property of shared concern. He used the phrase shared concern as if a thing could be divided into committees. Morrison's words sat on the table like a map we hadn't seen. Victor, with the nervous habit of a man who thought through contradiction, suggested a compromise. The family would retain primary custodial rights, but would consent to a provisional memorandum of understanding with the department that would recognize the need for oversight and create a joint stewardship plan. The memorandum would be provisional, temporary, revisitable, an attempt to lock both family privilege and public responsibility into a legal container. There were people at that table who saw different futures. Some scientists wanted samples, hair for DNA, blood for analysis. Some policymakers argued that once a non-human intelligence was established, jurisdiction would shift toward federal wildlife agencies. Our small house on the slope was suddenly a battleground of competing institutional instincts. The scientists wanted knowledge. The department wanted oversight and political cover. The family wanted privacy, safety, and a voice. We began to outline ground rules. No invasive procedures without documented consent, no photographs outside of pre-agreed contexts,
access limited to named researchers and only with family presence, criminal penalties for trespassers, heavy fines, swift prosecution. We drafted a protocol for determining Ezra's choices. Patricia insisted on multiple independent witnesses for any yes decision. Victor insisted on language that would recognize the family's standing to sue and to press charges on Ezra's behalf. Rachel fought for the right of trained scientists to collect observational data that could be used to establish baseline behaviors. It was an awkward human negotiation. The law trying to wrap around a creature the law had never been forced to fit.
The demonstration sessions were the kind of slow theater you only get in small towns when everyone has learned to be patient. Dr. Chen brought laminated pictures and a grid of simple choices. She had us repeat tests in different rooms and at different times of day. Rachel recorded thermal traces with a quiet camera that breathed like a sleeping animal. I watched Ezra's gaze as he considered pictures he had seen 1,000 times. Sky, bread, river. He would touch one and then pause, and then put his palm to his chest with the same insistence Sarah had taught him when she was 7. At one point, Dr. Chen placed 2 images side by side that had been chosen for their moral difference. A photo of a crowded roadside with people pointing, and a picture of our back meadow. She wanted to know what visibility meant to him. If he chose the crowd, would that mean he sought exposure? If he chose the meadow, would that mean a preference for seclusion? Ezra looked at both and slowly cupped his hand over the meadow, then traced a circle in the air like a small closing gate. The gesture was not unambiguous. Nothing is in those cases. But it was repeated. At different times, in different rooms, under different circumstances, he made the same motion. Repetition created a kind of language. That pattern, the repeated choice, was what Dr. Chen took into the reports she wrote to James Morrison and others in the chain. The reports were cautious and filled with cross-references to precedent and to the repeated consistency of behavior. They did not say person in the headline. They didn't have to. They said instead that an organism exhibits repeatable, deliberative behavior consistent with basic consent. That phrasing became the hinge victors used to draft language that could be presented in court as recognized interests. We arranged a provisional agreement in late October 1995. It was not a deed, it was paperwork that read like a compromise. The department agreed to restrain certain invasive actions. The family agreed to allow named researchers limited access under tight protocols. The Edgewood Trust, Victor proposed we create a trust, would fund protective measures and pay for legal defense should the family be challenged. We created a buffer zone on a map that shaded in a protective perimeter. None of it was absolute. The agreement read like a scaffolding, enough to climb on, but not a finished wall. We marked the signing with a small ritual. Rachel pinned a white envelope to the kitchen bulletin board that held the first copy of the memorandum. Patricia placed a typed note in the pages of our photo album acknowledging the family's role as guardians and promising an ethical stance. Victor joked about lamination and insurance in a way that made Catherine smile even while her fingers smoothed the paper like a prayer. I shook hands with men who had once been strangers and felt that tremor of alliance you get when institutions meet people who possess a different form of authority, lived experience. For a few weeks after the agreement, the world exhaled. The rhythm of our life reasserted itself like a song you had almost forgotten. We rationed visits to prevent overwhelm. Rachel would come with one camera and sit like a student learning the alphabet. Dr. Chen would observe with a notepad and complicated feelings. Patricia would take notes and make occasional recommendations. Less stressful stimuli, more green season visits rather than winter monitoring. Victor sat on the porch with a thermos and read legal journals as if boredom could be a prophylactic against misfortune. Then the world did what worlds do. People pushed boundaries. The trouble came one moonless night when a small group of men decided that secrets were worth risking their skin for. They were not sophisticated. They were thrill seekers, and a man or two attracted by the idea of reward. They came with flashlights and a borrowed rifle, guided by a rumor that had been fed on the edges of the town. They ignored the bell code.
They ignored the fences. They bypassed the old signs we had put up that read like threats because we had found threats easier than explanation. We heard them at first as a shape of sound, the snap of a twig, the scuff of boots. The dog we kept, an old border collie named Harlan, sat up and made a low, warning growl. Then a light swung across the windows and cut white across the room like a second daylight. Sarah woke with a sound that was not a scream, but a small choke of panic. Catherine reached for the bell and brought it down twice, 3 slow, the code for danger. I ran. There is no theater to violence in a house. A clumsy rush, a hand on a doorframe, the cold ring of adrenaline that makes the world sharper. I stepped out and saw shadows moving along the ridge, huddled figures with beams that punched holes in the night. I called out in the only voice I had practiced for this purpose, the one our family used when danger pressed. "This is private property. Come no further." One of the men turned and aimed. When a gun is pointed toward you, everything becomes a distance problem. It is not about courage, it is about geometry. I moved toward the porch like a man trying to close a door and felt the impact. A shock in my shoulder as if fire had passed through the meat of my arm. I fell back and heard a metallic clatter as the rifle hit the porch. Harlan barked and lunged, and then there was confusion. A man shouting, someone else running, enough commotion for the code to be triggered and for the neighbors to start stirring. They left before the sirens, which was, in a way, the worst of it. They thought that the noise would be the long arm of embarrassment. They thought that the night would cover their tracks, but Harlan had seen them.
A neighbor had been watching lights from his barn and called it in. Deputies arrived within minutes. The men were found less than a mile away, shivering and with cheap flashlights, and the rifle had a trace of animal hair on its stock that matched samples taken from us years before. They were arrested, charges were filed. I woke in the hospital with my shoulder heavy and my arm pinned, bright fluorescent light and a nurse with patient eyes. Catherine sat on the hard vinyl chair and looked at me with an expression that was made of small, terrible gratitude. "You almost didn't come back," she said, and the sentence had both accusation and relief braided through it. The doctors said the wound was not life-threatening, that I had been lucky. I remembered nothing of the bullet's exit except for a small burning disengagement where blood had warmed the air. I remember, though, the dull swell of anger that rose in me like a tide. Not at the men who had shot me, though I felt that, but at the world that had made violence seem like a plausible currency. In the hospital corridor, a reporter from a regional paper appeared, having been tipped off by one of the deputies. She had the look of someone who had not yet decided whether to be compassionate or hungry. She asked questions about safety, about the shooting, about whether we had ever imagined a night like this. Catherine answered with that same quiet force she uses when she is organizing a household. Small facts, no moral theater. The reporter took notes, then left. That same afternoon, someone else had a video, an amateur tape, grainy, with our dog barking and the flash of a flashlight. It moved from desk to desk in local newsrooms and then into the early folds of the internet, bulletin boards, listservs, and small chain emails. The leak was the real wound. The footage was small and unremarkable, but it contained enough to stoke imaginations. Phone calls multiplied. Our mailbox filled with letters, some kind, many more opportunistic. Men offering to buy access, to help with containment, to profit. My name was used in contexts I had not expected. A phone solicitor suggested a reality show. A man in a suit mailed a form that smelled of investor interest. The local gossip spooled into a national curiosity. People began to call the hill by names that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Victor moved quickly. He filed for emergency protective orders against the men who had trespassed and sought restraining orders against anyone who attempted to contact the family for nefarious purposes. He argued that the leak constituted a breach of the memorandum because it exposed Ezra to harm. James Morrison convened a small team to determine whether federal involvement should be escalated. Some voices recommended seizing Ezra for his protection under emergency authority.
Others, moved by Patricia's ethical framing, urged restraint and respect for the family's guardianship. We had less control than we imagined.
Once an image is out, it flickers into meaning. People made up narratives about what Ezra was like based on a single frame of film. He became, in the mouths of strangers, whatever they wanted him to be: menace, miracle, cash cow. The moral calculus shifted outward quickly. The same curiosity that had coaxed Rachel to our door now roared like a beast at the fence. Scientists began to call, some of them sincerely curious, others with an edge of predatory language. Conservation groups sent forms. A man with a nonprofit offered a press release template. We met in the kitchen, and the room felt too small for all the names floating in the air. Sarah cried in a way that was without melodrama, quiet and inward, a guillotine of grief over what we had lost. Emma, who had grown into an awkward adult of 13 in the month since the first visits, kept holding the drawings she had made, Ezra with a hand outstretched. Catherine's face hardened into a kind of resolution I had not seen since Thomas's last winter. "We have two choices," Victor said, and his voice had the bluntness of a man who had lived through negotiations that go bad. "We can attempt to retreat, to hide Ezra again, move him to the cave, make him vanish, or we can make a controlled revelation, work with ethical partners, and try to make the narrative ours. If we retreat, we risk being discovered again without the legal scaffolding. If we go public, we risk exploitation, but we might gain protections that are harder to unwound." I thought about Thomas and the cave he had dug into the slope. I thought about the Belt Code and about whether promises could be renewed or only broken. "What does Ezra want?" I asked. The question was the kind that could not be answered by a single measure. Ezra, in the months of tests, had on occasion indicated a guarded curiosity for the outside world. On other days, he sought the comfort of the hearth. But after the shooting, he retreated deeper into his routines. He avoided the window facing the road and spent long hours near the hearth, his head in his hands, as if he bore the weight of sudden knowledge. There were nights when he slept with Harlan curled between his legs, and in the mornings he would sometimes finger the edge of Sarah's drawings in a way that looked like a man relearning language. Dr. Chen sat with him a long afternoon and asked him, in our mediated way, if he'd like to be known. She put out the picture of the meadow and the city crowd again, and Ezra hesitated and then made a new gesture. He tapped the picture of the crowd and then traced, slowly, the picture of the sky, and then made a small motion with his fingers that Sarah said she had never seen before. He pointed toward the horizon and then bowed his head in a quick, almost human nod. "It looks like he's saying he wants to be understood, not exhibited," Sarah said afterward, whispering as if her words might bruise him. Dr. Chen noted the nuance and wrote it down. "It was not consent in the abstract. It was a leaning toward being known on terms. So we chose visibility, but not the chaos of a rumor mill. We decided on a single partner who had a record of long, careful storytelling. Victor negotiated with National Geographic. The editors, after much back and forth, proposed a profile, a feature that would emphasize context, ethics, and the voices of caretakers. They agreed to our conditions: no sensational covers, no baiting of Ezra, images framed in domestic context, a limitation on how pictures could be used commercially, and a pledge to collaborate with Dr. Chen to avoid intrusive methods. They also wanted editorial control to ensure their readers would understand the science and the stakes. It was not an idyllic solution, but it was a way to shape the narrative. The photo shoot was staged with the precision of a small peace treaty. Photographers came slow and careful, like doctors entering a sick room. They sat on the porch and had me pour coffee while Sarah placed a blanket over Ezra's knees. The camera's lens felt like a third eye, curious but non-threatening. Ezra tolerated the presence. He rubbed the blanket in that small domestic way he had always done, and when the photographer asked if they could take a full-body shot, he looked at Sarah and then at me. He put his palm to his chest and tapped the image of himself we had on the table,
small, like approval. The National Geographic piece ran in March 1996. It was less the circus I had feared and more a long, patient, documentary-style profile that foregrounded family. The pictures were careful. Ezra sitting with Sarah on a stoop, Harlan asleep at his feet, a close-up of his hands as they mended a torn sleeve, one frame of him looking out over the meadow with the mountain like an impossible horizon behind him. The article called attention to ethics. It included Patricia Chen's sober commentary on consent and Victor's description of the legal maneuvers that had been undertaken. It did not declare Ezra human. It did, however, give him a face in the public imaginary that was not only fear. The effect was immediate and complicated. There were donations from people who wanted to support the trust. Proposals for research grants came in with the earnestness of academic hunger. Old friends brought casseroles and a quiet relief. There were also men who sent offers that reeked of commerce. Some politicians called for hearings. The Department of the Interior insisted on a review and proposed a panel to determine the protections necessary to balance public curiosity and safety. It was a bureaucratic ritual. Hearings, testimony, cross-examination, and it felt at times like a public autopsy where the family's desires were dissected in public view. Over the course of the year, we assembled a patchwork of protections. It was not a single legal victory. It was a series of smaller wins and perpetual negotiations.
The trust, Edgewood, named half as a joke and half as an aspiration, was funded by a combination of private donations, small grants, and a portion of a contingency fund set up from a modest licensing of the National Geographic feature for educational use. Victor filed for preservation easements on the land that would make development difficult. The department agreed to limit any seizure to extraordinary circumstances, requiring a court order and a demonstration of immediate danger. Researchers were credentialed through an ethics review board that included Patricia and, crucially, members of our family. These protections were fragile. Each one could be challenged. The press loved to cast the arrangements as either miracles or jokes. They called our agreement both unprecedented and legally ambiguous. Politicians sometimes threatened to step in when constituents complained. We had to keep re-arguing our case in public and in private, in hearings and in op-eds, and in the dull paperwork of permits. It was exhausting. It was also necessary. The routine that emerged was a new kind of household choreography. Ezra's life became a series of windows, times when visitors could come and times when he could rest. Dr. Chen would bring a small team and sit like a careful aunt, watching patterns and recommending rest days. Rachel continued her observations with more sophisticated thermal cameras that were respectful of his space. Victor kept an eye on the legal horizon and sometimes, late at night, sent emails I suspected were prayers disguised as meadows. There were losses, too. The applause of public interest stripped away some of the soft privacy we had once had. Ezra, who had loved the quiet of a particular stone by the stream, sometimes moved away when the stream became a backdrop for cameras. He learned to read tension in the faces of people who approached him, a skill old enough to make my bones ache. There were days he would hide in Thomas's cave for comfort, not out of fear, but from a need for solitude. And the cave, once a contingency, became a refuge. I watched him there, the light striking the edge of his jaw, and sometimes wondered if we had done him a kindness or a wrong. There were victories, small and large. After an especially fraught hearing in a dark municipal building, a judge, older, with a face like a weathered ledger, ruled that our memorandum would be given deference in any immediate protective legal action, and that any attempt to seize Ezra required a higher threshold of proof. The ruling was not absolute. It was a nudge in our direction, an institutional recognition that families sometimes do the work of care better than distant bureaucracies. We celebrated with black coffee and a slice of lemon pie, as if such things could be trophies. There were other, more human moments. Michael married a woman from the next town and brought her home to meet the household. She cried when Ezra touched her hand in that slow way he had, the gesture radiating some ancient permission. Sarah graduated high school with Ezra in the backyard, watching as if to note the bends of life in the people who loved him. Emma drew a series of pictures that were later used in a small educational pamphlet intended to teach children about empathy and boundaries. Over time, the narrative shifted, incrementally, from outright sensationalism to something more complicated. People began to talk about what it meant to extend moral regard beyond their species. Conversations in the town diner altered. The man who had once peddled quick rumors now talked about ethics in a way that used fewer slurs and more curiosity. People who once had been sly in their questions began to ask them as if they were searching for answers rather than fodder. I will not lie. There were nights when the cost of recognition felt unbearable. The pings of the phone, the letters, the climate of novelty, these things compounded. Yet in those same nights, I found as well an odd solace, the recognition that a thing we had loved had been witnessed and acknowledged. It was not a cure-all. It was, at best, a way to stop moving through fog. I think about that period often because it required of us a kind of moral dexterity that families rarely practice. We had to argue in courts and kitchens with tearful grandchildren and with men wearing ties. We had to learn the legal language of guardianship and the loopholes of conservation easements while still remembering how to set a table. We had to be both protectors and translators. It was, at times, a terrible and human apprenticeship. In the years that followed, the framework we had put in place became part of the furniture of the family. The trust paid for a ranger on retainer to patrol the perimeter. The easement made the land less attractive to developers. We established a small fund for Ezra's welfare that paid for food and the occasional medical consultation with non-invasive methods. The research that was done was, by and large, as respectful as one could reasonably ask. Long observational periods, programming that allowed for retreat, and an ethics board that included voices from the family. Rachel Foster continued to be a steady presence, a scientist who had learned the humility that comes with touching another mind. The political climate, however, was never fully quiet. There were hearings and newscasters and the inevitable pundits who dressed small human tragedies in large moral absolutes. Our arrangements were cited in academic papers about the ethics of interspecies contact. They were criticized for setting a dangerous precedent. They were praised as a model for compassionate stewardship. The truth was simpler and harsher. The protections were fragile, contestable, and subject to the pressures of time and national mood.
And Ezra, how do I speak of him in those terms without sounding like a man who has finally chosen a sermon? He was, through all of it, Ezra. He liked the same things he had always liked. He mended, still, more carefully than some carpenters, and he enjoyed the small rituals of the house. Catherine's coffee cooling on the porch, the light at noon, the way Sarah hummed when she shelled peas. He never became a metaphor for anything. He became a presence at the table, whose existence forced others to examine their own. One afternoon, years later, when the public noise had dulled into a steady but manageable murmur, I sat with him on the bench we had built by the stream. The bench faces the slope where Thomas dug his cave. Thomas, who had been a man with hands that promised. Ezra rubbed his fingers in the crate of the bench until he found a groove, and laughed, a small, low sound that contained exactly nothing of the mocking world outside. Harlan lay at our feet, sleeping. The light was late and kind. I thought of how many times promises had been made and kept and broken inside the handful of years we had been in the light. "Do you ever want to go?" I asked him once, in the small way one asks another permission to speak of the obvious. He put his palm to the picture of sky on the table we kept for him, and then placed his hand on mine. The gesture was not a sentence, it was a shared weather report. We had taught him many of the things a family teaches: how to live alongside others, how to be still in the presence of risk, how to measure choice.
He had taught us, in return, that obligation to a life is a kind of law that has no courtroom. There are consequences to choosing to bring something like Ezra into human society. There are costs to choosing to let it remain hidden. Each choice carries with it a ledger of gains and losses. Sometimes people ask, strangers, journalists, men who like to end interviews with a neat moral, whether I regret Thomas's choice. The question sits in the air like smoke. I do not regret the immediate, human kindness of Thomas's act. A man in war learns that you do not always leave the wounded to the cold. But I also know that kindness summons obligations you cannot imagine until they arrive like weather. There were days, many, when I wished the world had not noticed us at all. And there were others when I felt that seeing, if done carefully, was a kind of redemption. The law, finally, was less a hero than a mechanism, messy, slow, sometimes humane, sometimes indifferent. We learned to work within it while recognizing its limits. We kept teaching Ezra the language of choices and watched the institutional language try to accommodate those choices, often awkwardly. We were, in a sense, educators of the law. People ask me if there are others, if Ezra is the only one. I do not know. We found tracks in the pines sometimes that did not match his, but the pastures of rumor are dangerous. Dr.
Chen cautioned against assuming populations from anecdote. For the family's moral life, the question mattered less than the simple fact that one living mind had been shown a measure of care and recognition. There were hints, always hints, a footprint here, a fleeting sighting at dawn, but nothing that could make a statute. In the end, the story that the papers loved, "This family hid a Bigfoot for decades until the government knocked," is a headline that flattens the subtleties into a neat tease. What happened next was not a single event, but decades of small decisions. We negotiated with institutions, with our neighbors, with ourselves. We learned to be translators between species and between law and ethics. We endured a season of violence and a season of public attention, and we built a fragile scaffolding of protections that continues to be tested. I believe, from the years I have lived in its shadow, that those protections have made a difference. On quiet mornings, when the bell hangs silent and the house breathes evenly, I will sometimes hear the sound of the mountain shifting and wonder if we did the right thing. The answer is not singular. We kept a promise that began in 1945 because a man could not walk away from grief and because a family learned to carry what one man left them. We exposed Ezra because hiding had become untenable, and because there were people, wise, careful, and sometimes naive, who wanted to build protections rather than cages. We wound up with a net, imperfect, sometimes frayed, but present. There is a last thing I want to say about the bell. We still ring it, though now it is more an invitation than a code. The bell sits on the porch and calls family to dinner, and sometimes calls a scientist who has made herself part of our small life. It summons a set of obligations that are older than any statute: care, witness, patience. When people ask me whether the government's knock destroyed us or saved us, I say both. It changed us. It forced us into the public square where the language of law and the grammar of compassion could meet and sometimes marry, awkwardly. It cost us private silence, and it gave us, in return, something like notice. If you take anything away from this, consider a question that I ask often now, when the nights are long and the house is hushed. How would you treat another mind that isn't human? Would you teach it to trust you? Would you protect it in law? Would you try to listen when its language is foreign? We did what we thought right. We kept trying. That is the thing that matters when histories are told. What you did in the small hours of practical obligation. Thomas taught us to keep a promise. We kept it, imperfectly and stubbornly, and we learned how complicated a vow can be. So, when I tell you that the government knocked and that everything that came after was messy and hard and sometimes beautiful, believe that mess. Believe the hard. And then ask yourself, quietly, in what corner of your life, Might there be a bell that you could ring to call someone into protection rather than exposure? If this story stays with you, let it be a small invitation. Think about the obligations that follow from seeing. If you can, hold that thought, and then act on it in the small domestic ways that, in the end, make law out of love.